investment, that is actually something we can analyze mathematically and describe mathematically in a way that we can never mathematically describe a ridership prediction. Those kinds of predictions are, of course, sociology and psychology and so on, and I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about geometry. So think about this question. How many adult elephants would fit in a wine glass? Drawing not to scale. Notice the feeling you have about your answer to that question. The feeling that you have is called geometric or axiomatic certainty, because you recognize this as an example of the general principle that objects do not fit in containers smaller than themselves. And that is an example of an axiom about physical space, which it is basically impossible to doubt. So now think about this question. We think it's dangerous to predict the future, but I bet you're absolutely confident of making this prediction about the future, right? That in 2100, we still know how many elephants would fit in a wine glass. If I asked you, if there were elephants in wine glasses on Mars, how many elephants would fit in a wine glass, you'll realize you're actually willing to make this prediction about all of space, because we understand that we're talking about a basic fact about reality. So a lot of studies out there, because human beings want to talk about themselves and hear about themselves, and so a lot of studies out there that are sociology and psychology and so on, not that they aren't great, not that they aren't enlightening, but they're about a drama that's playing out on a stage. And I want to talk about the stage. I want to talk about the brute facts of reality within which all that drama plays out. So again, what's a city? It's a shortage of space per person, which brings us to this famous diagram, which is another illustration of the principle that too many large objects do not fit in small spaces. Same principle as elephants and wine glasses. So you've seen this image, the amount of space that 100 people take if they're in cars, if they're on a bus, or if they're on bicycles. And we have to keep coming back to this image because it is, again, something that it is impossible to doubt because it is a purely geometric fact unrelated to anybody's psychology or desires. So this is the point. It doesn't matter how many people want to drive cars. In the city, there is a limit on how many people will be able to drive cars. So if you take a purely market approach that people should be able to drive as much as they want to drive, you are going to run into a physical limit in the city. It is what we squishy urban liberals call unsustainable, which is a polite bureaucratic word meaning doomed. It means it cannot continue this way because we will run out of a resource, which in this case is space. So, and that is why the two solutions to that problem are either to get people to gather in large vehicles, which is what public transit is, or to get people to use vehicles that are not much bigger than their bodies, which is what bicycles and scooters are. Technology. Randall mentioned technology, all the cool technologies coming down the line. There have always been cool technologies coming down the line. They've never changed anything about geometry. Technology does not change geometry. So that's how much space people take if they're on a bus. That's how much space people take if they're in cars. That's how much space they take if they're on Uber and Lyft. Actually, it's a little worse than this. Uber and Lyft are saving us on parking space by consuming more street space. Why? Because they deadhead. They run empty from one job to the next. And I've seen studies estimating, Bruce Schaller's work out of New York, estimating that up to half of all Uber and Lyft vehicle miles are actually running empty without a passenger, going from one job to another. So that's an actual doubling of traffic by moving people from private cars to Uber and Lyft. It's a reduction in parking demand, but it's an increase in vehicle miles traveled. So that's Uber and Lyft. Now, once we have driverless cars, it'll all be different. Right now, it'll look like this. Now, here's where the driverless car people come at me, and they say, no, 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 because the cars will be closer together, see, so we won't need as much space. So that's true when you achieve level 5 automation. When we achieve, and there's a reason why driverless car tests are happening in Arizona, because once actual weather occurs, you have a whole bunch of problems that they're not remotely ready for yet. And level 5 is still very far off. Level 5, when you really do not need a human being to do anything, when the steering wheel disappears and the human beings are immersed in their laptops, that's a long ways off. It's a much harder problem than anyone's even talking about now. But And the other thing, of course, is that where you really save space with driverless cars by reducing stopping distance is on freeways where the stopping distance is very long because people are going fast. In urban streets, stopping distance is already pretty short because traffic isn't going very fast, so there's not that much space to save. Meanwhile, one thing about this is much, much worse. A phenomenon called induced demand. And induced demand is a fancy word for a brutally simple principle that you all know and that it's impossible to doubt, which is that if you make a desired thing easier, people will do it more. This is the one thing that most of my conservative friends just will not wrap their heads around, because it is the reason why you cannot simply let the market decide, because we will run out of room, and we will run out of room even more quickly. This principle that if you make something easy, people do it more, is an axiom of biology, but it's pretty nearly axiomatic to our understanding of an organism. One good definition of life is that it's stuff that needs. Life starts with needing a resource of some kind and consuming a resource of some kind. So the basic math of life is that you have to spend less energy seeking a resource than you will get from the resource. If that math doesn't work out on a positive balance, you're dead. So that math is what's driving it. So of course, if you can get a resource more easily with less effort, you're going to take more of that resource. That's induced demand, right? You don't need any more economic studies. It's just brute axiomatic biology. So the terror of driverless cars is the terror that the sudden elimination of the hassle of driving is going to cause an absolute explosion of vehicle trips, which big cities know they can't handle, and a lot of much less dense places will discover quickly that they run out of room for once all these trips start happening. Then it's also what it's going to do to land development. So Randall gets to live in a forest. I live in the middle of Portland. I'd love to live in a forest, but at the very least, I'd love to have a cabin in the woods that I could go to on the weekends. And I could afford that cabin probably, but the reason I don't buy the cabin in the woods is that it would be horrible to drive out there on Friday night and horrible to drive back on Sunday night. It'd be incredibly stressful, and so I don't do it. But if I didn't have to drive, if I could watch television on my way to the cabin and back, I might buy that cabin in the woods, and so would everybody else, and we'd chop down the woods and just have cabins. And that's suburban sprawl. And some of us have a problem with the complete demolition of the natural world that would start to happen when it's that easy. That's why I'm very optimistic about the driverless bus. I think that a lot of remember, transit operating cost is 70% labor. So everything about the economics of transit that Randall describes on the operations side changes completely when we don't have labor. And that's obviously a long transition. Several European countries are out ahead. The French, of all people, are France, a culture founded on striking, where striking is a fundamental element of the national identity, is converting major rail lines in Paris to driverless, and all of the new rail lines will be driverless. And the driverless bus is coming. The driverless bus is an easier problem than the driverless car because it doesn't go into all the places that a driverless car goes. It's not going to get stuck in alleys and so on. So don't get these things confused. There are different problems of transport which have different solutions. Now, my friends in the tech industry want to package them all up and merge them together into a vision of the future, and I find that very confusing, and I want to take them apart to help people think clearly. There's a problem of emissions and the efficient use of energy for which the solution is electric vehicles. There are problems of the efficient use of labor and also of safety for which the solution is autonomous vehicles, and there is a problem of the efficient use of space for which the solution is big vehicles, and also bicycles and scooters. And big vehicles mean transit, and if I had more time, I'd talk about how that implies a network, services working together, and that's one of the reasons why you can't just rampantly privatize it all. So coming back to this then, my point again is that all transit policy is local because everything about transit changes with density. People live at different densities, and understandably they have different views of transit based on the immediate problem of their lives, which is presented by the kind of community they live in. So I'm arguing essentially that at least we ought to be able to let go of the whole stupid urban-rural culture war and understand that rural and urban people have always had different perspectives. You can go back to ancient texts and find that's true in ancient Rome. And those perspectives arise from the fact that they're having different experiences, and that's completely understandable. And it's completely understandable if the politics are going to be like this, with places like Seattle absolutely screaming about transit, and places like Wyoming not really seeing the point. So again, national statistics are useless. This graph that Randall likes to show is to some extent also a history of urban density. It is about the history in which the density at which people live radically declined during that very period in which you see the line declining. Of course, because transit is a response to density and it's a solution for dense places. You'll also notice that the line hit bottom around 76 and has been going up and down in a very small range since then. And even the recent drops of the last few years are in the historic range of sort of 50 more or less. So I don't think we're looking at a catastrophe, but more important, although transit death spirals can occur, and everyone in Washington, D.C. should be aware of this if they use transit at all, they will ultimately become existential crises for the city, and at that point there will be leadership necessary to stop them. Because when you get to that point where everybody is screaming about transit, which is where Seattle was 15 years ago, leadership responds to that, and stuff gets done, and the trend starts turning around. And one of the things I will say, which is also very relevant to WMATA, is that yes, you have to run service in order to get ridership. And Seattle's it's not just Seattle's dramatic expansion of service that's mattered, but also it's also municipal leadership, which was crucial in Seattle. Seattle did not let its regional transit agency tell it what its transit should look like. The regional agency runs most of its transit, but Seattle chose to take charge of it by applying all of the leverage that they have as a city, particularly in their control of street design and their control of land use. And they used those tools to leverage better service from the transit agency. And I make it sound kind of adversarial. It was at the beginning. I remember when we started this process, when I worked on the first Seattle Transit Plan. It's not adversarial anymore because the transit agency sees its interest being met in being able to run faster service because there's better infrastructure. And they see their interest being met in the fact that they're getting more riders. So Seattle is not just about the fact that it has a very dense downtown and a very dense city. It's also about the fact that the city acted in response to its reality and made certain choices to make that kind of place work and to enable that kind of place to continue to grow in the ways that people want. And I want to say one more thing to my conservative friends about this, which is if you believe in the free market, you've got to face the fact that the free market is telling us to. If San Francisco were such a horrible, dysfunctional place, it would not be so expensive to live there, right? So that is the market telling us to build more dense cities, and dense cities are going to need more transit. Now, I want to end on a note of potential left-right agreement here, which is that there are, on the urban left, emerging signs right at the intellectual level at the moment, but it's going to percolate out into policymakers. Early signs of what I would call urban federalism, or an urban small federal government movement. And intellectuals like Benjamin Barber, Bruce Katz, Edward Glaser, writing books talking about the uniqueness of the dense city, the unique role that the dense city has in any healthy economy, which is why a whole country should care about it, and the need for dense cities to govern themselves more. It is ridiculous that New York City, which uses the New York City subway, doesn't control the New York City subway. It's ridiculous the degree to which